15 years of marriage, seemingly an eternity. Clara and Jeremy had once been the perfect couple. The kind people say are made for each other. They met at university when Clara was a literature student and Jeremy studied architecture. Their first meeting happened in the campus cafe, where Clara accidentally spilled coffee on his drawings. Instead of getting angry, Jeremy laughed and said, "Now they'll become a work of art." That moment became the starting point of their love, sincere and deep. They couldn't get enough of each other. Strolling until dawn, exchanging letters full of passion and tenderness, dreaming about the future. Everything seemed boundless and eternal. Their wedding was modest but filled with happiness. Clara remembers how Jeremy looked at her that day, with endless love and the promise of always being by her side. Over time, their family grew. First came their eldest son, Evan, a cheerful and energetic boy whose laughter filled their home with joy. Then the twins arrived, Lily and Noah. Lily was a dreamer who loved books and fairy tales, while Noah was an explorer, always trying to take toys apart to see how they worked. Each child marked a new stage in their life, filled with joy, sleepless nights, first steps, and bedtime stories. Their home was full of life. Clara and Jeremy laughed together, went on family trips, and read to the children before bed. Their love seemed unbreakable, and their family happiness unchanging. But the years passed, and something changed unnoticed. The house, the children, their shared plans. All of that remained, but the spark was gone. Jeremy stayed late at work more often, losing himself in his laptop screen, while Clara felt more like a housekeeper than a woman. She hadn't caught her husband's admiring glances in a long time, hadn't heard compliments, hadn't felt those gentle nerves before a date, because there were no more dates. She remembered how Jeremy, in his youth, could suddenly take her by the hand and lead her on a nighttime stroll, how they kissed in the rain, how he whispered words of love. Now he seemed distant. Their conversations were brief, concerning only daily routines and the children. Their bedroom had lost its passion, leaving only habit. For a long time, Clara tried to convince herself that this was normal, that it happens to everyone. But deep down, she longed to feel loved and desired again. She didn't want to remain only the mother of their children. She wanted to be the woman for whom men do crazy things. Clara spent the entire day in doubt. She couldn't remember the last time she had done something for herself, without thinking about the house, her husband, or the children. Evening promised to be the same as usual, just another day dissolved in routine. But something inside her whispered, "Go. Immerse yourself in another world, even if only for a while." She walked into a bar, inhaling the smells of alcohol, coffee, and cigarette smoke. The place was noisy, filled with conversation and music, creating a sense of freedom and detachment from reality. She ordered a glass of wine and felt warmth spreading through her body. Her gaze lingered on the bartender. Young, attractive, with a confident, almost brazen smile. He seemed to embody everything she felt she was missing. Lightness, adventure, spontaneity. "Something stronger or a light cocktail?" he asked, leaning toward her over the bar. "What would you recommend?" Clara replied with a playful smile, feeling something awaken inside her. Something that made her blood race faster. They began talking. At first, it was a light conversation, no strings attached. Then it grew deeper. Clara told him about her life, her children, and how difficult it was to keep passion alive in a marriage. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding and pouring her a new cocktail. Time passed unnoticed. She started coming back to that bar again and again, finding there a refuge from her thoughts. Now she wanted not just to feel young, but to feel wanted. She noticed how he looked at her, how he leaned in closer, as if inviting her to take one more step. One evening, he suggested they go for a walk. They strolled along the waterfront, illuminated by soft lamplight. The air smelled of the night, the sea, and something new and dangerous. He took her hand, and Clara did not pull away. This moment felt like it was beyond reality. They walked in silence, yet that silence meant more than 1,000 words. From that evening on, Clara could no longer deny it. She was infatuated. Renee became a drug to her, a desire that flared stronger and stronger. She tried to fight it, but every night her thoughts returned to him. His voice, his smile, the light touch of his hand. All of it haunted her. One day he asked, "Are you happy?" Clara froze. She didn't know what to say, because the answer spinning in her head was terrifying. Clara tried to convince herself that her meetings with Renee were just harmless fun, a breath of freedom she desperately needed. But each evening spent with him blurred the boundary of what was allowed even more. She started lying to her husband, staying in the bar longer than she planned, and found herself looking forward to the moment she would see Renee again. One evening, when the bar was almost empty, he reached out and covered her hand with his. "You know you're special?" he whispered, leaning in closer. Clara felt her breathing falter. A fire blazed inside her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt such excitement. Her heart was beating fast, like a girl on her first date. She didn't pull her hand away. Renee watched her, his thoughts racing. He could sense her trembling, see how her gaze flickered between fear and yearning. He wasn't foolish. He knew he was dealing with a woman torn by doubt. Yet there was something about her that drew him in, wouldn't let him go. He couldn't claim it was love. More an intense desire to possess her, to see how far she would go. Jeremy wasn't just angry. He was suffering. The pain of realizing her betrayal was unbearable, tearing him apart inside. He remembered how he had loved Clara, how he had fought for their marriage, how he had built their family. In his mind, he still clung to that time when she looked at him with adoration, when her eyes shone with genuine affection. Now, in them he saw fear, confusion, and something else, pity. That pity was killing him. He didn't want to be the one who had been betrayed and left behind. He couldn't let himself be the victim. So he chose another path, control. If he couldn't have her love back, he would make her depend on him, so she'd have nowhere else to go. He knew her secret, and now that secret belonged to him. Yet alongside his pain lived another feeling, hope. Hope that everything could still be fixed, that if he showed her they could start over, they could survive it all. He tried to recall the early years of their marriage, how their home felt, their conversations, how Clara laughed when he teased her. He clung desperately to these memories, but reality kept shattering his illusions. "You've been so different lately," he said one night over dinner, as they sat facing each other. "So distracted. Is something bothering you?" Clara froze for a split second, then forced a smile. "Just tired," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Jeremy smirked. She lied, and he knew the truth. But beyond that lie, he saw not just fear of being exposed, but her inner struggle. She wasn't just afraid. She was tormented. Deep down, he hoped that meant she still felt something for him. He began moving carefully. Now his game was not just about power. He wanted to win back her feelings, to make her realize he was better than the man to whom she had granted a place in her life. He started reminding her about the past. Places they loved, old jokes, little habits that were theirs alone. He carefully wove memories into conversation, hoping to see a glimmer of what once had been between them. But at the same time, he kept pressing. Little by little, he made her dependent. At first, small requests, picking up the kids, changing plans, doing things for him, even if it was inconvenient. Then he became more demanding, forcing her to put his interests above her own. And every time Clara tried to object, he would just give her a long look, and she would back down immediately. He asked her questions with no easy answers. "Have you ever thought of making everything right again? If we had a second chance, would you take it?" She remained silent or answered evasively. And Jeremy clenched his teeth, because he knew she had already made her choice. Still, he persisted. He started touching her as he used to, casually but gently. He'd place a hand on her back as they left a room, hold her gaze a little longer, speak more softly. Sometimes he thought she responded, that there was a flicker of regret in her eyes. Then one night, as Clara was falling asleep beside him, he quietly asked, "Have you ever thought of telling me the truth?" She didn't answer immediately. He felt her breathing hitch, her body tense. "Jeremy, just be honest," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. She was silent for a long time, then whispered, "Yes." He closed his eyes. He should have felt anger, triumph, satisfaction. But instead, he felt only pain. Jeremy was no longer the man she had once loved. Now he was someone else. A man clinging to the remnants of the past, trying to get back something that might already be gone. And Clara began to realize that her own betrayal had turned her into a prisoner, but he, too, had become a hostage of this game. Renee had long noticed her. Not in the same way as the usual female customers who came to the bar, flirted, and left their number. Clara was different. There was something reserved, mysterious about her. Her smile was never carefree. Her eyes revealed an internal struggle. He saw she was searching for something, perhaps without even knowing what it was. "I think you're afraid," he went on. "Afraid of what you've wanted for a long time." His words sounded like a challenge. Clara realized she was standing on the edge of a precipice. One step and there would be no turning back. She trembled when he lightly ran his finger along the inside of her wrist. The gesture was both gentle and alarmingly intimate. She looked at him. His gaze was calm, confident, revealing a readiness to catch her if she jumped. Renee savored the moment. He saw how she quivered, how her breathing came in gasps. He sensed her fear and her desire. He liked the tension, the risk. He didn't know how it would end, but he wanted to try. "I can't," she whispered, but her voice wavered. Too weak a denial. "Yes, you can." His lips nearly touched her ear. "The only question is whether you want to." Just then, her phone vibrated on the bar. Clara recoiled, as if snapping out of a trance. On the screen glowed a message from Jeremy. "Are you coming home soon?" She felt shame and panic pierce her like needles. What was she doing? How far had she gone? Renee noticed the change in her expression and gently withdrew his hand. He recognized that look, the look of a woman who stands on the edge of a choice. He did not stop her. He just watched. "You know where to find me," he said with a light smile tinged with uncertainty. Clara grabbed her phone, tossed some money on the table, and hurried to the exit. The night air hit her face, but brought no relief. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her fingers trembled. She needed to get home, to her children, to her husband. But when she lay down in bed next to Jeremy, listening to his even breathing, she realized her mind remained in that bar. In those few seconds when her world teetered on the razor-thin edge between duty and desire. Renee, left alone behind the bar, watched her go. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling impatience grow inside him. He knew she would return. He could feel it. The only question was when. And the precarious balance could still collapse at any moment. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was spiraling out of control. She thought that after the night she fled the bar, everything would end. She tried to be a caring wife and mother, but thoughts of Renee seeped into her mind like poison, tainting every day. Every morning, she woke with a resolve to break this vicious cycle. Every morning, she promised herself she would never return to that bar. But by evening, all her resistance vanished. She couldn't explain it. Was it attraction, an addiction, or a desperate attempt to escape the routine? She only knew she was drawn to him with irresistible force. One evening, Clara found herself once again standing at the bar's entrance. Anxiety pounded in her chest. She knew she was doing wrong, but her feet carried her inside on their own. The bar was awash in dim light, the sounds of jazz, and hushed conversations. There, behind the counter, stood Renee. He met her gaze with a slight smile, as if he'd known she would come back. "You're late," he said softly, handing her a glass of wine. Clara felt as if her life was suspended in midair. She had left, but she didn't feel free. For the first time in many years, she was living alone, without Jeremy, without their established order. Yet even at a distance, he continued to loom over her life. Not with words or threats, but with something deeper. The bond that had held them so long, memories. A past that hadn't disappeared. She tried telling herself that now everything would change. That life with Renee would be the start of something new. He was young, passionate, and with him she again felt desirable. But was that really the case? In his eyes, She sought what she had so missed during the last years of marriage. Hope, sincerity, a sense of home. Instead, she began to see something else. Frivolity, uncertainty, and worst of all, a feeling of alienation. Renee wasn't Jeremy. He wasn't the man with whom she had built a family, shared pain and joy, highs and lows. He didn't understand her the way Jeremy did. He didn't feel her doubts or her inner turmoil, and when Clara realized that, her heart clenched with pain. Living alone turned out to be more difficult than she had imagined. In the first weeks, she tried to enjoy her newfound freedom. Long walks, morning coffee on the balcony, reading books she'd never had time for. She treated herself to candlelit dinners, drifted off in the silence once filled by Jeremy's TV or the children's voices. It seemed she now had a chance to start over. But emptiness soon filled her evenings. She caught herself mechanically cooking dinner for 4, glancing at her phone's screen, waiting for a message that would never come. In her new apartment, there were no children's voices, no laughter, no scattered toys. She missed their sneakers lying around in the hallway, their bedtime story requests, their endless questions. Her children were still with her, but she sensed it was hard for them as well. Evan tried to act more grown-up than he was, taking on the role of protector for his sisters. Lily retreated further into books, distancing herself as if building invisible walls. And Noah asked questions to which Clara had no answers. Why doesn't Dad live with us? Does he still love us? Clara tried to preserve their familiar routine: school, activities, walks. But the children felt that everything had changed. They missed their father, and that tore her heart. Sometimes she found she couldn't utter a single word when they talked about him, as if her voice was stuck in her throat. Meanwhile, Jeremy wasn't idle. He didn't chase her or try to bring her back. He waited. He knew everything required time, that the illusion of new love could blind her, but ultimately reality would prevail. He watched Clara from afar, not interfering, but studying her every step, her every move. Then he made his first move. One evening, Clara received a letter, on paper, not an electronic message. The handwriting was familiar, neat, reserved, the same with which he had written notes to her many years ago. You're free, but you're still mine. You can deny it, you can run, but deep down you know the truth. No one knows you like I do. No one understands you like I do. Now answer me. Are you happy? Clara read these lines over and over, her hands shaking. She tried to tell herself it was just another act of manipulation, but fear flared inside her, because she knew the answer. She wasn't happy. A few days went by before she resolved to meet Jeremy. It was her idea. He hadn't asked or insisted. But Clara knew she couldn't go on until she looked into his eyes and said what needed to be said. When she walked into the cafe where they had agreed to meet, her heart was pounding. Jeremy was already there. He looked calm, but Clara knew him too well not to notice the tension in his hands, the coldness in his eyes. You came, he said quietly. Clara sat down across from him and swallowed hard. We need to talk. Yes, he agreed. We do. And at that moment, their game entered its final stage. One where there was no longer room for illusions. Clara's fingers trembled as she took his hand. She felt the tension between them building, the unbearable weight of expectation, the inevitability of it all. I shouldn't have come, she whispered, but her voice was uncertain. Renee leaned in, his voice lowering. But you did. In that instant, Clara understood she could no longer fight herself. She was drawn to him as if he were a lifesaver, though she knew he was really a storm capable of destroying her life. They left the bar together. A slow rain was falling, reflected in the yellow glow of streetlights. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as Renee walked beside her, not touching her but filling every inch of her skin with the awareness of his presence. I have a room, he said quietly, looking at her. Clara didn't answer. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body had already made its choice. They disappeared into the darkness of the night, a place with no more rules, only desire and fear. The next morning, Clara woke with a sense of emptiness. The room was still filled with the scent of his skin, the memory of the night. She covered her face with her hands, feeling something inside her tear apart. It was inevitable. She had crossed the line from which there was no turning back. And the scariest part was realizing she had liked it. She reached for her phone, but before she could pick it up, the screen lit up with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You're playing with fire, Clara. Be careful." Her heart sank. She glanced around as though someone might be hiding in the shadows. Who could it be? Jeremy? One of her friends? Or, worse yet, someone she hadn't even suspected? Now she had to find out how much more deceit her life could bear before it all came crashing down. Clara couldn't get that message out of her head. It haunted her, echoed in her thoughts every second. Who could it be? Jeremy? It didn't seem likely he would play guessing games. A friend? Or, worse yet, a stranger who knew her secret? She spent the whole day on edge, waiting for a new threat, a new sign someone was watching. Her phone felt like ice in her hand, her fingers trembling as she typed a message to Renee. "We need to talk. It's important." His reply came almost instantly. "Tonight. Same place." All the way to the bar, Clara looked around, trying to see if anyone was following her. Her fear intensified with each step, but inside she also felt anticipation. A thrill at the thought of seeing Renee again, despite the threat hanging over her. When she entered the bar, Renee was already waiting. Concern flickered in his eyes, but so did curiosity. "What happened?" he asked, leaning forward. Clara clutched her phone and silently showed him the message. Renee's gaze scanned the screen before he lifted his eyes to hers. "Did you tell anyone?" His voice was serious, tinged with worry. "Of course not." Clara felt panic surge. "I don't know who it could be." He studied her carefully, then put the phone in his pocket. "Maybe it's someone who just wants to scare you. Or..." He paused, obviously weighing possibilities. "Or what?" She couldn't stand the suspense. "Or someone really is watching us," he said quietly. Clara shuddered. The idea that their affair might not be secret made her heart clench. She glanced around, but no one looked suspicious. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "What should I do?" she whispered. "First, stay calm." Renee leaned closer. "Don't make any sudden moves. Maybe it's just a provocation." Clara nodded, but fear knotted her insides. She couldn't tell Jeremy. She couldn't trust her friends. The only person she felt she could turn to was sitting across from her. When she got home, Jeremy was waiting in the kitchen. His gaze was dark, guarded. "You're late," he said. "Yes?" Clara forced a tight smile, trying not to give herself away. "I stopped for coffee after work." Jeremy said nothing, just watched her. Something new flickered in his eyes. Something elusive. What if he already knew? What if he was the one sending those messages? In truth, Jeremy had been suspicious for a while. He noticed how Clara's behavior changed. Her sudden absences, her waning interest in family evenings, the nervousness she thought he didn't see. He didn't want to believe the worst, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at him. One night, he checked her phone while she slept. There was nothing incriminating, but that, too, alarmed him. Clara had always left texts, shopping lists, reminders. Now her phone was almost empty. That meant only one thing. She was hiding something. Jeremy didn't want a confrontation. He decided not to attack right away, but to follow her. That's how he learned about the bar, that Clara went there alone, about the man she spoke to. That evening when she came home, he already knew. He didn't have the details, but in his heart he sensed the truth. So he kept silent. He watched her, studied her excuses. He didn't need words. He wanted to see how far she would go. But instead of rage, a different plan formed in his mind. He realized this was his chance. He could use her betrayal for his own ends. He moved carefully, making it seem like he noticed nothing, but his attention to details doubled. He began gathering evidence, saving her calls, her messages, even tracking her movements. Every step she took was now in his favor. One night, while Clara slept, Jeremy sat in his study, reviewing his notes. He saw how his wife smiled at that man, how her eyes lit up in his presence. But he felt no pain, only a cold calculation. He could make her pay for it, and not just morally. Now he wasn't merely waiting for her to slip up. He was preparing to make her affair his most potent weapon. Jeremy increasingly realized that holding Clara under his control was not the solution. The more he tried to force her to feel guilty, the further she pulled away. He saw how she mechanically carried out his requests, how her smile became more strained. But something in her gaze had changed. There was no longer fear. There was something else, something that began to scare even him. He kept telling himself that they could still fix things, but despair grew inside him. He woke in the night to watch her sleeping face, her closed eyes, her lips he had once kissed so fervently. He hoped to see something familiar, something that could be rekindled. But the woman lying next to him had become a stranger, a woman whose heart he had lost. One night, when Clara stayed out later than usual, he felt his patience slip away. A storm raged inside him. Anger, pain, humiliation. He picked up her phone, knowing he'd likely find nothing, since Clara had become more cautious. But he didn't need proof. He already knew the truth. When Clara entered the house, it was nearly midnight. She saw him sitting in the dark kitchen and stopped in the doorway. "You're still up?" Her voice was quiet, but not guilty. "I was waiting," he said, his fingers curling into fists. "Where were you?" "With a friend," she replied without hesitation. "You think I'll believe that?" His voice was cold, emotionless. She didn't reply, only drew a deep breath. Then he understood. She was no longer afraid of him. She wasn't defying him or holding him in contempt. She had simply reached a point where she wouldn't be his puppet anymore. "Clara." His voice caught as he struggled to contain his despair. "Why? Isn't everything we have enough? Haven't I tried? Haven't I loved you?" She looked at him, and something like compassion appeared in her eyes. It hurt him worse than any accusation would. She just stood there, not scared and not in love. "Jeremy, I can't bring back what's dead," she said calmly. "I tried, but our feelings have disappeared. I don't know if we can get them back." He felt his world collapsing within him. All his plans, all his manipulation, everything he'd tried to build, turned to dust. He wanted to scream, to tell her she had destroyed their family, that he would never forgive her. But he couldn't, because deep down he knew she was right. Pain engulfed him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Everything he had believed in was crumbling. He wanted to ask her, "Did you ever remember how I loved you? How I held your hand the night Evan was born? How I built our home so you'd be happy?" But the words stuck in his throat. He gazed at her and saw not a traitor, but the woman he had lost. Yet what if love couldn't be recovered, but he could make her regret it? Jeremy wasn't about to let her go so easily. He knew her life with this new man wouldn't be what she imagined. He knew that sooner or later she would realize that perfect love doesn't exist, that passion fades, that illusions crumble. He knew she would turn back one day, which is why he didn't argue or beg her to stay. He simply said, "Fine, if that's your decision." But something inside him shattered. Whether it was love or hate, he could no longer tell. Clara left the next morning, but Jeremy didn't feel defeated. He waited. He watched. He let her believe she was free. But deep down he knew this story wasn't over yet. Clara sat across from Jeremy, feeling the tension between them fill the air. He didn't look angry or desperate, but there was something new in his eyes, a cold calculation that frightened her more than his old rage. "So you want to talk?" he said, folding his arms. "All right, let's talk." Clara nervously clenched her fingers. She had come to close the door on the past, to end this once and for all, but now she wasn't sure she had the strength. "I don't want this war between us anymore," she said quietly. "The children, they're suffering. We have to find a way to move on." Jeremy smirked joylessly. "Move on? You mean you can do that? Are you happy, Clara?" She swallowed hard. The answer was obvious, but saying it out loud felt like betraying herself. She looked away, which was enough for Jeremy. His lips twisted in a humorless grin, his suspicions confirmed. "You always like to dream," he went on. But dreams are one thing, reality another. You thought you could walk away from our marriage and find happiness in someone else's arms? Now you're here, sitting with me, because deep down you know no one understands you like I do. No one gets you like I do. His words burned because there was truth in them. Clara felt anger flood her. She refused to admit it to herself, but she couldn't lie anymore. It doesn't change what happened between us, she said firmly. We can't go back. Maybe not, he said, leaning closer. But we can't truly walk away from each other either. Their eyes locked, and Clara realized just how dangerous this game was. She wanted to break free, but Jeremy had no intention of letting her go so easily. What do you want, Jeremy? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He smiled, something unsettling in his gaze. Time will tell, he said. I'm in no hurry. The main thing is that you're not sure which direction to go anymore. Anxiety swelled inside her. This conversation had resolved nothing. It only made their bond more twisted, more perilous. As she left the cafe, she understood the story was far from over. Perhaps the hardest part was yet to come. Jeremy watched Clara leave the cafe, a grim satisfaction stirring within him. He saw that his control over the situation was stronger than she realized. Now it was his turn to place the pieces on the chessboard. He wasn't going to act in a burst of rage. Revenge had to be cool-headed, calculated, something Clara would feel gradually, not all at once. He didn't want to ruin her life overnight. That would be too easy. Instead, he would make her recognize her mistake, make her regret every choice she'd made. The first step was to erode her sense of stability. He began with her job. Through his connections, he saw to it that her position in the company became unsteady, quietly, imperceptibly. Yet each day the pressure on Clara mounted. Her projects began to fail, colleagues grew distant, and management became more demanding. At first, she thought it was just stress or her own emotional state. Soon it was obvious. Someone was pulling the strings. Jeremy's approach was diabolically subtle. He didn't just destroy her career, he laid a trap. He arranged for Clara to be suspected of leaking company data, forging evidence so cleverly that she'd seem guilty. He knew this blow would cut deep. She would be accused of disloyalty, incompetence, and would have no chance to defend herself. She wouldn't just lose her job. She'd lose her reputation. Clara felt her world falling apart, the ground slipping from under her. Her evenings were spent in torment, trying to find an explanation. But the harder she tried to fight, the more helpless she felt. The children no longer looked at her the same way. She could see the unspoken question in their eyes. Did you ruin everything, Mom? Jeremy observed with an icy satisfaction. He had achieved his goal. She was broken. Yet why didn't he feel the triumph he had imagined? Why did each anguished look of hers pierce him with emptiness instead of victory? One evening, Clara returned home and found a letter on the table. The handwriting was familiar. I gave you freedom, but you didn't know what to do with it. You thought you could start over, but all you ever had was us. Now you see that. The question is, what will you do next? I'm waiting. Clara's hand shook as she gripped the letter. Fear and anger mingled inside her. She knew these weren't just words. It was a challenge, his final move. She knew exactly where to find him. When she walked into his house, he was already waiting. He looked as if he'd known she would come. They stared at each other in silence until Clara finally spoke. You did all of this. You destroyed my job, manipulated the kids, wanted me broken. He nodded, making no effort to hide it. You had to see that leaving me was a mistake. She laughed. A bitter, broken sound. And you think now I'll come back? That I'll just forget everything? Jeremy took a step closer. I don't know. But I do know this, you came here. Which means you're not sure. Her lips trembled. She hated him for it. For knowing her better than she knew herself. For seeing her weaknesses and using them against her. For the fact that despite everything, she still felt something toward him. But Clara had changed. She was no longer the woman who clung to love. Now she was someone who had seen the truth. You win, she said. But if you think this will bring me back, you're mistaken. I'm not the same person you remember. He didn't respond at once. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, at having once truly loved her, only to turn them both into enemies. But he quickly forced that emotion away, returning to his usual mask. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone among the ruins of their past. He didn't stop her because he knew that whatever happened next, both of them had already lost this game.